welcome to the October edition of HR Hot Topics. I'm your host, Jody Schaefer, and this is not going to be a 5-minute episode, folks, although you knew it was never going to be 5 minutes. This is actually our 5th take of this episode, which is unusual for us, but the last one was 14 minutes long. Don't be scared about the length. Be scared about what I'm going to tell you today. It's the October edition, and this should come with a warning that says mature audiences only. I'm going to tell you about 2 pieces of legislation that, if you're listening, should terrify you. The first is a state piece, and the second is at the federal level. Now, I want to make sure I'm really clear here. Neither of these things that I'm going to tell you about today are in effect currently. On the state side, it's in the beginning phases. It's 2 bills, a House bill and a Senate bill, that are being used as a jumping off point for some negotiation. But it looks like it's probably going to get some legs, so I want to make sure you all know about it. And it has to do with paid leave. And on the federal side, there is a proposed rule right now to increase the earning threshold for your salaried staff. So pay attention, because this affects all of you regardless of size. So let's talk about the state side first. At the end of August, Governor Whitmer delivered her What's Next address, and it laid out the priorities that she hopes the legislature takes up in the remainder of this legislative session. If you recall, the Dems have a slim majority in both the House, the Senate, and then of course we have a Democratic governor. And that hasn't happened in 40 years. And so there's been a lot of pent-up ideas and energy, and this caucus has made good on their initial promises at the start of the legislative session, have been very active and very successful in moving their agenda through. And so there's no reason to think that the second agenda here that Governor Whitmer outlined on the 30th of August would be any different. And one of the key things that I'm going to talk about today is a proposal for paid leave, mandated paid leave for employers of all sizes. So the name of this bill is the Michigan, I'm going to read it here because it's a long one, the Michigan Family Leave Optimal Coverage Benefits Act. That's a long way of saying paid FMLA leave. Now, for those of you that are under 50 employees, you might be thinking FMLA. Oh, well, then that means we're out. Well, yeah, under federal FMLA, you are, right? If you don't have 50 employees within a 75-mile radius, then you don't have to comply. But that's not what this is. This is kind of a spin-off of FMLA, but expanded reasons that an employee could utilize this leave beyond the typical FMLA reasons. And it would encompass things like bereavement and time off for preventative care appointments, time off for meetings at your child's school, time off if daycare closes due to a public health emergency. So it's a pretty expansive list all in of reasons that an employee could take time under this legislation. It would be paid time. Now, here's what's unique about this. Often when we hear mandates around paid time, the employers are required to create banks of time and fund those banks and then administer those banks. So the Paid Medical Leave Act in Michigan is a good example of that. This is slightly different. Michigan is looking at what 13 other states have already done. And rather than having these banks of leave time be administered by the employer, it would instead create a new state agency that would manage this bank of time, and it would be funded through a new payroll tax. So employers would still be footing the bill for this, but it would be done in a little different funding mechanism than what's historically been done. So there would be a new payroll tax, in addition to all the other payroll taxes that you currently pay. And this new tax would fund this new agency that would be developed, and up to 25% of all of the dollars collected, mind you, these are all employer dollars, 25% of that could be used to sustain the agency. So we're going to create a whole new state agency to manage this fund. And then once the fund balance reaches a point where we could actually start drawing claims from it, then employees who have a qualifying reason for leave, and remember that list is very exhaustive, would submit a claim to the state agency, and the state agency would pay up to 65% of their wages. And I think the cap is $788 a week in the current legislation. So think about it kind of like you think about unemployment, right? And I guess that's one of the things that scares me. The unemployment system is not the gold standard for how an agency safety net should be run. And for those of you that have had any interaction with unemployment, you know this to be true. And the folks at unemployment know this to be true. In fact, they've got a task force going on right now to find ways to improve that system. So now the legislation that's being considered is the creation of yet a second system. I don't know what they're going to model it after. I sure as hell hope it's not the unemployment system, but it seems very similar in process. So that concerns me. Obviously, the fact that there's a new payroll tax concerns me, especially for my small employers that can barely make ends meet now. But another concern I have is the amount of time that would be granted to an employee under this legislation. An employee could get up to 15 weeks of paid time off per year. 15 weeks. And it could be used in one large chunk. It could be used intermittently in one-day increments. For those of you that are managing FMLA programs right now in your place of business, you know what a nightmare it is to manage intermittent FMLA leave, and that's when it's not paid. Imagine when you can get paid to have intermittent leave. 15 weeks. And employers have to protect the employee's job while they're out and maintain health insurance while they're out. And all of that sounds like a noble cause, but I don't know how the dollars add up on that. I don't know how a small employer runs a business when they don't know from day to day if an employee is going to be out. And the fact that the employee can use up to 15 weeks of time to be out makes me question what's going to happen to the paid time off banks employers already offer. Are employers going to be able to offer both? Is this going to come back and kind of bite an employee actually? Because now maybe paid vacation, which is not a mandate, by the way. Employers are just choosing to offer that because they know that it's the right thing to do and they want to be competitive. But the dollar can only be stretched in so many ways. So are existing paid programs that are administered by the employer going to shrink because now we have to fund this new statewide safety net? I don't know. So that's a concern. But maybe my biggest concern of all around this is the true administrative burden that this is going to place on employers. For those of you that lived through COVID, if you furloughed any of your employees during the COVID shutdowns and pushed them to the unemployment system, because at that point you could make pretty good money on unemployment because there was a federal match to that, you know what a nightmare that was when the employee wasn't paid as expected. Who did they come to with questions? Who did they come to with frustrations when they couldn't get through to a live person at the unemployment insurance office? Who was the one that had to sort through the claims and what should and shouldn't have been paid? Who was the one that had to verify the legitimacy of the claims? You. And so I am concerned that even though the state is saying, oh, put this on us, just give us the dollars, we'll run it, you don't have to be involved, I question the actual truth of that. Because again, this person is still your employee even though they're out on leave. So when the state doesn't process the claim the way they are expecting it to, who do you think the employee is going to come to? You. And you're going to have a vested interest in trying to make this workable for them because you want them to stay employed with you. I don't know how small employers with no dedicated HR function are going to add that to the list of other things that they have to do. Even large employers with an HR function, who's going to manage this? And at the end of the day, you have no real control over it anyways. So I have a lot of concerns here. Michigan, as I said, is sort of modeling this after what some other states have done. There are 13 other states that are starting something like this. As you can imagine, they're mostly on the coasts, and they're in their infancy, right? They're still in the fun building phase of this plan. So, you know, they think it's going to function one way, but who knows until it actually gets up and running. I know one state had to double the percentage that they thought they were going to have to collect from employers because the math didn't work. Well, yeah, if we already have abuse of intermittent unpaid FMLA leave, what do you think the use is going to be of this new program when an employee can get paid at least 65% of their wages to be out with, you know, and I don't know what the verification process is going to be like. I mean, 15 weeks? 15 weeks? I don't know, folks. As I said, mature audiences only, right? For this HR Hot Topics. I do think that this legislature wants to make some impact on paid leave. But I also think that they want to do it in a way that can be successful and sustainable, that they can point to as a victory. And so I'm hopeful that that means that we have legislators who are open to hearing concerns or even suggestions for how to make this more workable for employers, especially small employers. My hope is that the current legislation, the House bill and the Senate bill, which I will link to in this message so you can read them, is simply a starting point, and that it's not what the final piece of legislation ultimately looks like, but that only happens with your interaction. And I don't ask this of you much, but I am going to ask this of you right now. If this concerns you at all, if you have strong opinions on it either way, I'm going to ask that you reach out to your elected official and make those concerns known, because we have kind of a sweet spot right now where if we get enough voices in the room, we might be able to mold this into something that looks different from what is currently being suggested, because I have a lot of concerns around that, and I will be doing the same thing that I'm recommending you all do. Let me shift also now. So that's like issue number one, right? So if you need to just, take a moment and take a drink, you just do that. If your drink has Bailey's in it, there's no judgment here, okay? Mine doesn't this morning, but okay, so that's the Michigan Family Leave Optimal Coverage Benefit Act. That's the state thing that I wanted to bring to your attention. But as I also previewed at the start of this message, there's something happening at the federal level that I also want to tune you into. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a piece of federal legislation, and it manages things like minimum wage and overtime and who has to comply with that and which employees you can carve out from overtime and consider exempt. Oftentimes we refer to those as salaried employees. And right now, to be considered salary, there are really two key tests that you have to pass. The first is the duties. So not every employee can be considered salary. You have to meet certain duties. And that's why a blue-collar employee would never be considered salary. Their duties would never align with the exemption testing. So there's a duties component, but then there's a second component that has to do with how much that employee earns. And there's a minimum earning threshold for somebody to be considered salary. Because remember, a salaried employee isn't eligible for overtime pay. There was some pushback when Obama was in the White House to increase that minimum earning threshold. And it was a pretty significant jump that they tried to push through. And then at the 11th hour, a Texas court put an injunction on it, and then it just kind of halted until Trump came into the White House the following year. And of course, he had different ideas on this, but it did increase slightly. And it's sat there ever since. So now we've got Biden in the White House, and they're looking at this minimum earning threshold again. And the Department of Labor, that kind of oversees this Fair Labor Standards Act, has proposed a new rule. And the new rule is that minimum earning threshold should be increased. And I'm going to tell you what it is currently. Right now, it's $35,568. And the proposal is that it would increase almost $20,000 to $55,068. So that's a huge jump. Right now, it's a proposed rule, and so they're soliciting public comment on that. So again, if you're feeling like an activist and you're writing your letter to, the state government, and you want to just turn around and write a little comment on this DOL proposed rule, awesome. So they're submitting public comments right now. They got about 60 days of that, and then they'll look at public comment and then issue the final rule with a future effective date. And then it's up to the courts to decide whether or not it's constitutional. So I think there's some back and forth about whether the increase will be as high as they're proposing, whether it will pass the court sniff test, so to speak. But I do think that we're going to see an increase. And I think it would be prudent for all of you right now to just take a look at your salaried employees and see if you have anyone that's currently making less than that $55,000 benchmark. So at least you can get your arms around, if this change went into effect, how would it impact you and your business? Which employees would be impacted? what are your options if you wanted to keep them an exempt employee, et cetera, especially since you've got budgeting season coming up. I'm guessing many of you are kind of fiscal year ends aligned with calendar year ends. So this is something to perhaps put in the budget for next year in case we see an increase here. And you've got folks in that middle right now. They're above the current threshold, but they would be below this proposed threshold. So take a look at that. Don't make any changes. Just start getting your data together and some strategies so that you can act if you need to in the future. So with that, if I haven't terrified you enough and you've stuck with me all the way through, thank you for that. As always, I will put links to some of this information in the email message, which is why it's really important that you join the mailing list so you get the links. On YouTube, you get the video, which is a great start, but it's not all of it. So make sure you check out the links. If you have any questions, you can reach me directly, Jody Schaefer at workwithhrm.com.